Central American region rich in history and culture has been deeply shaped by its colonial past. Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Pedro de Alvarado arrived on the shores of what we know now as Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. They encountered the thriving civilization of the Mayan peoples. What followed was a tragic and transformative period in history, a period of conquest, destruction, and cultural erasure. Yet it also a story of survival, resistance, and resilience that continues to shape the region today.
To understand the depth of the transformation, we must first look at the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors and their interaction with the indigenous people. The Maya, for example, were a highly advanced civilization. How did they respond to the Spanish invasion?
When Cortés and Alvarado arrived in Central America, they encountered the Maya, a civilization with deep knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and writing. The Spanish saw these cultures as obstacles to their quest for wealth and land. The Maya fought fiercely to defend their sovereignty, but despite their resistance, the Spanish overwhelmed them. Notable leaders like Tecumumán fought to protect their people from the foreign invaders. However, the force of the conquest and the diseases brought by Europeans were too much for the Maya to resist.
In addition to the physical violence, colonization imposed profound cultural changes. How did it affect the indigenous cultures of Central America?
Colonization led to the suppression of indigenous languages, religions, and cultural practices. The Spanish forced their language and Catholicism on the people, often forbidding indigenous practices. Temples and sacred sites were destroyed, and traditional rituals were erased. The Maya language, once widely spoken, was pushed to the margins.
The colonization had devastating demographic consequences. Can you explain how this affected the indigenous populations?
The indigenous population of Central America faced a catastrophic decline. Diseases like smallpox brought by Europeans devastated communities. The encomienda system forced indigenous people into labor, and many perished from exhaustion, violence, and exploitation. Some estimates suggest a 90% reduction in indigenous population by the end of the 16th century.
The economic impact of colonization is also deeply felt in the region. How did the exploitation of resources and labor affect the indigenous people?
The Spanish colonizers extracted immense wealth from the land. Gold and silver were mined, and agricultural products like coffee, sugar, and tobacco were grown on plantations using indigenous labor. The encomienda system allowed the Spanish landowners to exploit indigenous people for the labor. The colonial powers at the expense of the native population.
This exploitation has had lasting economic consequences. Indigenous people were left with few resources, and the wealth generated from their labor largely benefited the Spanish crown and European settlers. Today, these disparities persist. Indigenous communities continue to fight for land rights and economic justice, struggling against the long-lasting effects of colonial exploitation.
What is the situation for indigenous people in Central America today? How do they continue to deal with the legacy of colonization?
One powerful example is the work of Rigoberta Menchú, a Maya woman from Guatemala who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her advocacy for indigenous rights. Her efforts have inspired generations to continue to fight for justice and recognition. Rigoberta's work, along with the effort of countless other activists, shows the indigenous people are not just victims of history, they are also agents of change, reshaping their futures with courage and determination.
Are there any specific individuals or movements that stand out in the fight for indigenous rights?
Rigoberta Menchú is perhaps the most internationally recognized figure, but she is far from alone. There are many local activists who are advocating for indigenous rights in Central America. These often figures often come from within the communities themselves, carrying on a tradition of resistance that has lasted for centuries.
The personal stories of these individuals are powerful. Their struggles and dreams offer a window into the ongoing impact of colonization. These activities are not only fighting for their rights, they are telling the story of their people, and in doing so, they are reclaiming their dignity and their history.
How did the arrival of European colonizers affect indigenous civilizations in Central America?
The arrival of Europeans brought diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, which devastated the indigenous population. In addition, the conquistadors imposed their rule through violence, slavery, and forced labor.
How did the economy of Central America change after the arrival of the Spanish?
Before colonization, indigenous societies had economies based on subsistence, farming, and trade. With the arrival of the Spanish, an economic system based on resource extraction was imposed to benefit Spain.
The legacy of colonization in Central America is one of immense tragedy, but also of remarkable survival and resilience. The indigenous peoples of the region have faced the loss of their cultures, their lands, and their lives, but they have also fought, adapted, and flourished. Their struggles continue today as they fight for justice, recognition, and a future that honors their past. The journey from conquest to modern day revival as a testament to the strength of a people who, despite centuries of oppression, remain steadfast in their desire to preserve their culture, their identity, and their rights.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for